Welcome in, everyone. Ready to dive into hyperlexia in adults with autism. We're going to explore how this incredible ability to read can be both a superpower and, a challenge sometimes.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating area. Hyperlexia really challenges those assumptions that people often have about autism and how autistic people communicate. It shows us a different side of the spectrum, doesn't it? One that highlights, the unique strengths and all the diverse ways autistic individuals experience the world.
It does. Okay, so let's start by just like painting a picture.
Yeah.
What does hyperlexia actually look like in action? The sources we've got describe adults effortlessly reading complex texts, huge vocabularies, and a real love of reading, almost like they're just drawn to the written word.
Yeah, and it goes way beyond just being good at reading. Think about it. One study found that adults with hyperlexia can often memorize entire pages, whole pages, after reading it just once. That level of processing, the memory involved, is just, well, it's amazing. It's not something you see every day, that's for sure.
That's incredible. But you mentioned the challenge part of this. What are some of the downsides? I mean, if this ability is so amazing, what's the catch?
Well, imagine you can grasp, like, really complex scientific theories, no problem. But then you struggle to follow a simple conversation. Maybe you miss those nonverbal cues. That's the kind of paradox we're talking about with hyperlexia.
Makes sense. It's like a superpower that's amazing in one area, but then it can hold you back in others. How does this intense focus on written language, how does that affect daily life for adults with hyperlexia?
Let's take sensory overload. You might be incredible at research, analysis, because you absorb information from text so quickly. But then a noisy office. Forget it. It's just too much. You're overwhelmed, maybe even anxious.
So it's kind of about finding the right environments then, situations that let those strengths shine through without triggering those sensitivities.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Think of it as social gathering. Someone with hyperlexia walks in, it's loud, there's chatter everywhere, multiple conversations happening at once. It's just too much to process. Socializing becomes exhausting, even if they really want to connect with people.
We're seeing how this incredible reading ability can also create some unique challenges then. When it comes to social stuff, navigating a world that isn't always designed with neurodiversity in mind.
And it's crucial to remember that everyone's experience with hyperlexia is unique.
Right.
Some might love social settings while others find them just totally overwhelming. There's a whole spectrum of experiences within hyperlexia, just like within autism itself.
That's a really good point. So, knowing all this, how can adults with hyperlexia leverage their strengths while also navigating these challenges? How do they make it work?
Okay, let's start with the workplace. Someone with hyperlexia could really excel in a career with lots of reading, writing, in-depth research, roles that allow for independent work, a high level of focus, like, say, a librarian or a technical writer,
Yeah,
or even a data analyst.
that's interesting. What about personal relationships? How does hyperlexia play into that?
Well, imagine you process information primarily through reading and writing. Expressing yourself in writing might come much easier than verbally. So finding partners, friends who understand that, who appreciate that way of communicating, that's key for building strong relationships.
It's about finding those people who guess you, right? Who
Yeah.
appreciate how you communicate, how you experience the world.
Exactly. And it's about bridging that communication gap too, using written notes maybe, text messages to kind of supplement those verbal conversations, or finding activities you can share that don't rely so much on talking, like going to a museum or a concert.
Those are good suggestions. So we've talked about work, relationships. What about just general well-being? How can someone with hyperlexia find balance?
Think of it like this. Your brain is constantly processing information from the written word, like this superpower that's always on. Finding ways to manage that input, to create some quiet, some stillness that's crucial to avoid burning out, feeling overwhelmed.
Makes sense. So activities like meditation maybe,
Mhm.
or spending time outdoors, physical activity, things like that could help create those mental breaks, a sense of balance.
Absolutely. It's about recharging, reconnecting with yourself outside of that world of words.
This is really starting to paint a picture of how hyperlexia can shape a person's life. The good and the not so easy parts.
And we're really just scratching the surface here, aren't we? There's so much more to learn about hyperlexia. But I think we've got a good foundation now for understanding the strengths and challenges that come with this. Well, it's an extraordinary ability.
I agree. But before we move on, I want to leave you with a question to think about.
I'm listening.
If you're someone who just loves to read, you're drawn to the written word, how do you find that balance between that love of language and, and the demands of a world that isn't always designed for those who process information a little differently. We'll dig into that more in part 2 of our deep dive. Welcome back. Before I move on, I wanted to go back to something you mentioned before about finding that balance between loving language and living in a world that, well, it isn't always so accommodating.
Right. Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? Our sources actually highlighted a study where adults with hyperlexia, they described it like living in two different worlds. One is the world of words, where they feel totally at home, and then the other is the outside world, where communicating, interacting socially, it can feel like a whole other language.
That's such a powerful way to put it. It's like you have this incredible ability with written language. You can decode it, understand it. But then social interaction, those unwritten rules, they're a whole other challenge.
Exactly. Imagine walking into a room, it's crowded, everyone's talking, but it's in a language you don't get. You might pick up a word or two here and there, but mostly you're lost, overwhelmed. That's how some adults with hyperlexia describe social situations.
Wow. That really gives you a new perspective, doesn't it? It's like
Yeah.
this amazing gift, this superpower for language, but at the same time, this constant struggle to connect with people socially.
And that's where finding support comes in. Communities, relationships, people who understand. One source actually talked about online forums, specifically for adults with hyperlexia. They said it was a lifeline, a place to connect with people who get it, share experiences without being judged.
Finding your tribe, right? Even if it's online.
Yeah.
What about those everyday interactions, though, where you can't just log on to a forum?
Well, then it's about coping mechanisms, strategies for communication. One thing that came up in the research was using scripts, like having pre-prepared responses for those common social situations. Takes the pressure off, makes things less overwhelming.
Like a cheat sheet for social stuff. Brilliant. Are there any other strategies that work?
Oh yeah, lots. Routine and structure are big ones. A predictable schedule, it helps minimize anxiety, creates stability. It's like a framework for your day, so you're not constantly hit with surprises or changes of plan.
So we've got support groups, communication strategies, routines. What about technology? Can that help empower adults with hyperlexia?
Absolutely. One source called text-to-speech software a total game changer. It meant they could access information, engage with the world, but in a way that was comfortable for them. Instead of reading a book visually, you listen to it.
It opens up so many possibilities, doesn't it? Like having someone narrate all those books and
Oh,
articles.
exactly. And there's tons of other assistive tech out there too. Noise-canceling headphones to cut down on sensory overload, visual timers for time management.
It's amazing how technology can really support those unique strengths we've talked about a lot, but one thing I keep thinking about is, well, how society views hyperlexia. Is there enough awareness? Understanding.
That's a great point, honestly. I think we've got a long way to go. Hyperlexia often gets overshadowed by the more well-known challenges of autism, which leads to misdiagnosis, lack of support.
So it's about raising awareness then, not just in the medical world, but everywhere.
For sure. We need to educate everyone, teachers, employers, just the general public, so people with hyperlexia can get the understanding and support they need to truly thrive.
This deep dive has been so insightful. The strengths, the challenges, the strategies. We've even touched on the bigger societal picture.
And we're not done yet. It's an ongoing journey, isn't it? As we learn and grow, we need to remember to embrace neurodiversity, create a world where everyone, no matter how their brain is wired, feels valued, supported.
Well said. Now, before we head to part 3, I've got a question for you listeners.
Okay, I'm curious.
Think about all the incredible abilities and talents out there. How can we, as a society, change our view, see these differences not as problems, but as strengths that make our world a richer place? That's something to think about as we head into the final part of our deep dive. Welcome back, everyone, for our final part. Before the break, we were talking about shifting our perspective, seeing neurodiversity as a strength. Our sources had some interesting thoughts on that.
Yeah, one that really stuck with me is this idea of neurodiversity affirming practices. Basically, it's about moving away from that whole fixing or curing mindset when it comes to neurological differences. Instead, we focus on creating environments where those differences are supported and celebrated.
So instead of like trying to force everyone into the same mold, we're saying, hey, there are lots of different molds out there, and they can all be beautiful and valuable.
Exactly. Think about a garden, right? If you only have one type of flower, it might look nice, but it's also really vulnerable to disease, to changes in the environment. But a garden with lots of different flowers, it's not only more interesting to look at, it's also way more resilient.
I love that analogy. So how do we actually apply this neurodiversity affirming stuff in the real world?
It all starts with education and awareness. We need to be teaching kids from a young age about how diverse human brains are, that there are different ways of learning, processing information, interacting with the world.
So instead of labeling certain ways of thinking or behaving as wrong, we're teaching kids to appreciate those differences, to see them as part of what makes each of us unique and interesting.
Exactly. Imagine a classroom where a kid who's a visual learner can use graphic organizers and diagrams, while a kid who learns best through sound can listen to audiobooks or have group discussions.
That sounds so much more engaging and inclusive than the way things are usually done.
And this whole neurodiversity affirming thing, it goes way beyond school. Think about workplaces where employees are encouraged to use their strengths instead of being forced to fit into a box.
So instead of that whole corporate mold thing, we're talking about workplaces that value flexibility, creativity, being yourself.
Right. And that's good for everyone. Employees can work in a way that feels authentic, and companies get more innovation and productivity.
It's win-win. This has really been eye-opening. We've talked about hyperlexia, the challenges, the strategies, but I want to go back to something. We focused a lot on the challenges, especially in social situations. But what about the strengths? What do adults with hyperlexia bring to the table?
Such a good point. One of the sources talked about the incredible attention to detail that a lot of adults with hyperlexia have. They can spot patterns, inconsistencies, things that others might miss. Really valuable in fields like research, editing, data analysis.
It's like having a built-in superpower for those little details that can make all the difference.
Exactly. And this attention to detail often comes with a real love of learning, a thirst for knowledge. Many adults with hyperlexia, they're big readers. They've got this huge store of information.
So they're not just good at absorbing information, they're passionate about it, about learning and understanding the world.
Exactly. And that passion often translates into a strong work ethic, a real dedication to doing their best.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We've learned about hyperlexia, the ups and downs, strategies for navigating it all, and we even talked about a world where neurodiversity is celebrated.
It has been a journey, hasn't it? As we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay, go for it.
The world is full of incredible diversity, not just in how we look, but in how our brains work. Let's embrace those differences, learn from each other, and create a world where everyone has a chance to shine.
That's a great message to end on. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you've learned something new about hyperlexia and the amazing potential of neurodiversity. Remember, creating a more inclusive and equitable world starts with each of us. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep celebrating the beauty of human diversity.